They say every colony in the New World began with a man's ambition, a conqueror's map, a king's decree, a merchant's greed. But Maryland began with something else. A name, a devotion. A queen whose face the colony would carry for centuries, even as her story vanished from memory. Few today remember her. Fewer still know why her name lingers on every map, every license plate, every anthem sung beneath the Chesapeake sky. Who was she? And what power did she wield, quietly, invisibly, from across an ocean? The tale begins not with muskets and ships, but with whispers. Whispers of faith, forbidden devotion, and a royal love that defied England's rage. Imagine a queen draped in silk and secrecy, moving like a ghost through the marble corridors of Whitehall Palace. A woman torn between duty to her husband, the King of England, and loyalty to her God, a faith despised in her own kingdom. Every step she took was watched. Every prayer she whispered could have been her undoing. Yet somehow, through that suffocating silence, a colony was born in her honor, not as a tribute of vanity, but as an act of quiet rebellion. They called it Mary Land. A new world, carrying the echo of a forbidden queen. But why her? Why would England, a nation divided by faith and fear, dare to name a colony after a Catholic queen? And who risked everything to make that happen? To understand the queen behind the colony, we must first step back into a kingdom tearing itself apart, a land where faith could cost you your crown, or your life. 17th century England was a land built on fear. Fear of heresy, fear of rebellion, fear of the wrong prayer whispered at the wrong time. The crown had changed hands so many times between Protestant and Catholic rulers that loyalty to either faith could become a death sentence overnight. The throne of King Charles I stood on uneasy ground, and beside him, his queen, Henrietta Maria, was both his strength and his curse. A French-born Catholic in a Protestant realm, she was the living embodiment of everything England despised. Pamphlets called her the Popish Witch. Preachers damned her from pulpits as the foreign serpent corrupting the crown, and yet, the king loved her fiercely. While mobs burned effigies of the Queen in London's streets, whispers traveled through court corridors of secret alliances forming in her shadow. Among those who dared to believe in her quiet defiance was a man named George Calvert, a loyal statesman who had served under King James I before Charles. Calvert had once been trusted, wealthy, respected. But when he confessed his conversion to Catholicism, the same England that had knighted him turned its back. He was forced to resign, stripped of his titles of influence, and branded an enemy of the faith. Still, the Queen saw something in him, perhaps a reflection of her own exile within power. Together, through correspondence and royal favor whispered behind closed doors, Calvert was granted the chance to seek redemption not through war, but through vision. If England could not tolerate his faith, perhaps a new land could. A place far from the reach of those who burned churches and silenced prayers. A colony that could serve as sanctuary. For Catholics, yes, but for all who wished to worship without fear. It was a dangerous idea. An idea that could cost both the Queen and Calvert everything. But in a kingdom where faith was the spark for every sword drawn, visionaries often rose from the ashes of persecution. And so, George Calvert began to dream, not of escape, but of creation. A land untouched by England's hatred, where devotion could breathe freely. A dream so powerful it would outlive the man himself. George Calvert's dream began, as all great rebellions do, not with gunpowder or steel, but with silence. He no longer belonged in the glittering halls of London, where suspicion clung to him like smoke. Yet in that exile, he began to see something greater than England's cold mercy. A world across the sea, wild, untamed, and unshackled by the king's decrees, called to him like a promise. He imagined a place where faith could not be punished, where prayer was not a crime. A land not ruled by fear, but by tolerance. It was audacious, dangerous, even foolish. But to a man stripped of everything except conviction, it was also irresistible. Calvert secured a royal charter for a colony he called Avalon, on the misty coasts of Newfoundland. But the promise of freedom met the brutal hand of nature. Freezing winds, failed harvests, disease, and mutiny destroyed Avalon before it ever became the refuge he dreamed of. The land that was supposed to save them had turned against them. Calvert, sick and heartbroken, returned to England, but not defeated. He refused to believe that God would end his mission in the ice. He pleaded for a new charter, further south, where the soil was rich and the air forgiving. It was a desperate gamble, one last chance to give his faith a home before his life gave out, and though the king hesitated, there were whispers in the court, voices that remembered the queen's quiet kindness, her sympathy for those cast out in the name of faith. When the petition finally passed, Calvert had his new hope, but time was cruel. Before he could set sail, before his eyes could meet the horizon he had prayed for, George Calvert died. The dream, however, did not die with him. It lingered like a sacred inheritance, unfinished, waiting for a hand strong enough to carry it across the ocean. That hand belonged to his son, Cecil Calvert. A man young enough to see what his father could not, yet wise enough to understand the peril that came with the dream. Now, the vision of a new world, and the Queen's shadow behind it, was about to pass into his keeping. When George Calvert drew his final breath, England paid him little mind. To the court, he was just another noble who had overreached and fallen. But to his son, Cecil Calvert, he was a prophet whose dreams still flickered, faint, fragile, and waiting to be revived. Cecil was not his father. He lacked George's weathered hands, his diplomat's confidence, his stubborn defiance. What he possessed instead was patience, a colder, quieter kind of power. Where his father had fought the system head-on, Cecil would learn to outthink it. He inherited more than a vision, he inherited enemies. The name Calvert had become a whispered curse among England's Puritan elite, traitors to the faith, Catholic sympathizers, manipulators of royal favor. Every petition Cecil sent to the crown was dissected for hidden motives. Every move he made was shadowed by spies who hoped to catch him betraying England for Rome, and yet, he persisted. He spent years navigating a court that despised him, crafting his requests with the precision of a surgeon. He learned when to flatter, when to vanish, when to let silence work harder than speech. And above all, he learned one crucial truth: the only protection against a kingdom's hatred was a queen's favor. Rumors swirled through Whitehall of a certain sympathy from the royal chambers. Whispers that Queen Henrietta Maria, the Catholic queen who endured the venom of England's Protestant clergy, had taken an interest in the young Calvert's cause. She had never met him, not formally, not in the open, but something about his father's vision spoke to her, a vision of faith unshackled, of mercy amid persecution. In private audiences, she may have spoken to the king on his behalf. No records confirm it. Yet the timing of Cecil's charter approval, the tone of the king's final signature, it all bore her invisible hand. When the royal seal was pressed into wax, the new colony was born, a second chance. A final inheritance of his father's dream, carried by a mother's compassion and a queen's defiance. Cecil Calvert would call it Maryland, not after himself, not after his father, but after the woman whose unseen influence had made it possible. But who was this queen? And what power did she hold in a kingdom that wanted her silenced? She was born into splendor, Henrietta Maria of France, the youngest daughter of King Henry IV, a child of cathedrals and coronations. From the day she could walk, her world was draped in incense and ritual. Faith wasn't just belief to her, it was blood, duty, and defiance. When she married England's King Charles I, she entered not a royal union, but a battlefield. The English people despised her before she even arrived. A Catholic queen on a Protestant throne was more than scandalous, it was treasonous in their eyes. From the start, she was watched, mocked, accused of plotting to drag England back to Rome. But behind the gossip and pamphlets, Henrietta Maria was not the fragile consort they imagined. She was clever, politically astute, and dangerously persuasive when she chose to be. While Charles struggled to hold his divided kingdom together, she maneuvered quietly, using diplomacy, charity, and subtle influence to shield those who shared her persecuted faith. It was in this quiet resistance that Cecil Calvert's plea reached her. A colony where Catholics could live in peace, away from England's mobs and inquisitions. The idea would have sounded almost sacred to her. She understood what it meant to kneel in fear, to hide her prayers behind closed doors. So when the request came for royal approval, she spoke, not loudly, not publicly, but with precision. She didn't demand. She suggested. She didn't command. She inspired. And Charles, ever her defender, listened. When the colony's charter was finally signed, it was done under her shadow, and for her honor. Cecil Calvert named it Maryland, Terra Mariae, the land of Mary. Officially, it was in homage to the Virgin Mary, patron of purity, but everyone close to the court knew the double meaning. Maryland was also the Queen's land, a living monument to Henrietta Maria's endurance, carved from the wilderness of the New World. Yet that tribute came at a cost. In a nation already boiling with religious suspicion, to name a colony after a Catholic queen was an open provocation, a spark thrown into a powder keg. For the Calverts and the Crown alike, Maryland would not just be a refuge. It would become a test of loyalty, of faith, and of survival itself. The naming of Maryland was more than a gesture, it was a declaration. And in a kingdom already fractured by faith, declarations had consequences. When news reached England's Puritan factions that a new colony had been granted in honor of the Popish Queen, outrage ignited like wildfire. Pamphlets spread across London accusing the Calverts of conspiring with Rome to plant a Catholic stronghold in the New World. To them, Maryland wasn't a colony, it was heresy on a map. Even in Parliament, the whispers grew bolder. The Queen's land, they sneered, will soon fly the Pope's flag. For the Calverts, the danger wasn't only political, it was existential. Cecil Calvert's charter hung by a thread of royal favor. One shift in power, one uprising, and everything his father had sacrificed could be stripped away. Yet he pressed forward, guided by the same stubborn faith that had driven his family for generations. The gamble was breathtaking. He was a Catholic nobleman founding a colony under a Protestant king, protected only by the love of a queen despised by half her country. He knew that one wrong move could doom not only his family, but every soul who sought refuge under Maryland's banner. Still, the plan unfolded. Ships were prepared, the Ark and the Dove, to carry settlers across the Atlantic. Aboard were both Catholics and Protestants, men and women bound not by creed, but by desperation. Many fled persecution, others chased fortune. All of them were stepping into uncertainty, carrying with them the fragile hope that across the ocean lay a world untouched by England's fury. When they reached the shores of the Chesapeake Bay in 1634, the settlers knelt and prayed, not as Catholics or Protestants, but as survivors. For one fleeting moment, the dream of coexistence seemed real. A land where faith would no longer divide, but unite. But England's divisions had long arms, and peace in the New World was fragile. The same storms of suspicion and hatred that tore through London were already gathering on the horizon. Maryland had been born of a queen's quiet rebellion and a noble's desperate faith, but both would soon be tested by the darkness that followed them across the sea. The settlers of Maryland landed with prayers on their lips and sunlight on the water, believing they had outrun England's shadow. But peace, like the tide, never stayed still for long. At first, the promise of this new land seemed almost divine. Crops took root, trade began. A wooden cross was raised on the banks of St. Mary's River, and beside it, a Protestant chapel was built. Two houses of faith standing side by side, something England itself could never tolerate. For a time, it worked. Catholics and Protestants shared labor, food, and the fragile dream of coexistence. The Calverts governed carefully, enforcing respect, tempering disputes, and reminding the settlers that this was a land for all who sought freedom. But whispers began to return across the ocean. England was spiraling again, civil war brewing between king and parliament, between loyalty and rebellion. The Puritans were gaining strength, and with every victory they claimed in London, their fury reached further west. Soon, Maryland's peace began to fracture. Protestant settlers, encouraged by the rising Puritan movement back home, started to question why a Catholic family ruled over them. Sermons grew sharper, dividing neighbors who once shared the same table. Old English resentments resurfaced in the New World. Accusations of favoritism, of hidden masses held in the night, of secret letters sent to Rome. The dream George Calvert had built and Cecil Calvert had carried was being tested. Maryland was no longer just a refuge, it had become a battlefield of conscience. Then came the uprisings. Settlers turned on their leaders. Rumors of rebellion reached the Calverts' ears. Ships once meant for trade now carried weapons. Even those who had come seeking peace now wondered which side of faith would keep them alive. The governor's men tried to restore order, but the colony's fragile unity splintered. Maryland, born from devotion and tolerance, began to mirror the very kingdom it was meant to escape. Cecil Calvert watched from across the sea, helpless to intervene, as the world his father imagined threatened to crumble into the same hatred that had exiled them both. And yet, from the ashes of that unrest, a miracle would soon rise, one that would defy centuries of persecution and echo across the future of a nation. By 1649, Maryland was a colony standing on the edge of collapse. Religious tension had carved lines through towns and families, and the dream of peace was slipping into violence. Across the Atlantic, England's civil war had ended with the unimaginable, King Charles I executed, Queen Henrietta Maria exiled, and the Puritans in control. For Cecil Calvert, it meant the crown that had protected Maryland was gone. The Queen's gentle shadow, the very spirit that had made the colony possible, had vanished into exile. Yet, in this moment of despair, Calvert made a choice that would change history. Rather than tighten control or favor his own, he drafted something unheard of, the Maryland Toleration Act. It was short, fragile, and easily misunderstood, but revolutionary. It declared that no one in Maryland would be punished for worshiping as a Christian, no matter their denomination. In a world where men were executed for a prayer, this was nothing short of rebellion against centuries of hatred. When the law passed, the colony paused. For the first time, Catholics and Protestants could legally pray without fear. Church bells rang on both sides of the divide. It was a quiet triumph, a moment when faith and law finally stood on the same ground. And though it was imperfect, though it still excluded those outside Christianity, it was a spark of something extraordinary, a recognition that conscience itself was sacred. The Act of Toleration became Maryland's fragile miracle, born from the very chaos that threatened to destroy it. But even as peace returned for a breath of time, dark clouds still gathered beyond the horizon. The Puritan Parliament in England viewed Maryland's Catholic leadership with suspicion. Royalists were hunted. Loyal families were stripped of their land. And with the Queen's name still tied to the colony, Maryland's brief peace felt like a candle flickering in a storm. The same law that promised freedom would soon invite retribution. For every act of mercy in history, there comes a reckoning, and Maryland's was already on its way. Because in a world ruled by zeal and vengeance, tolerance was never meant to last. And the colony built in a queen's name was about to pay the price for her defiance. The peace born of the Act of Toleration did not last long. Barely a few years after it was signed, the tide of power turned once again, and this time, it came crashing down upon Maryland with merciless force. The Puritans, triumphant in England after the fall of the monarchy, looked across the Atlantic and saw in Maryland a reminder of everything they despised: a Catholic-led colony named for a Catholic queen. To them, it wasn't a refuge, it was an affront, and so, when Puritan settlers in Maryland rebelled, they did so with England's blessing. In 1654, the Protestant Revolution erupted on Maryland's soil. The Calvert's authority was stripped away, the Catholic leadership was overthrown. The Toleration Act, Maryland's fragile miracle, was repealed, replaced by laws that made Catholic worship once again a crime. Priests fled or were silenced. Chapels were destroyed. Crosses were burned. And the land that had once promised freedom was ruled once again by fear. From exile, Cecil Calvert could only watch as his father's dream and the Queen's silent gift turned to ashes. For years, Maryland drifted between chaos and control, its original purpose forgotten, its sacred name reduced to political ammunition. By the time the monarchy was restored in England, and the Calvert's charter reinstated, the damage had already been done. The vision that once made Maryland a beacon of tolerance was buried beneath generations of suspicion and silence. As for Queen Henrietta Maria, she died far from the land that bore her name. Exiled in France, she watched her husband executed, her son hunted, and her faith reviled. History branded her troublesome, foreign, arrogant, yet never recognized what she truly was: the quiet architect behind one of the earliest experiments in religious liberty the world had ever seen. In the centuries that followed, her name faded into the background. Children in Maryland would grow up never knowing the queen who gave their home its name, nor the exiled family who built it from devotion and defiance. The dream of tolerance had fallen. But history has a way of keeping embers alive, even beneath centuries of dust. Because while the world forgot her story, her name, Mary, never disappeared from the map. And one day, that forgotten name would rise again as a symbol of what it once meant. Centuries passed, and with them, the memory of the Queen faded into whispers. Maryland grew, its cities rising, its borders expanding, but the story of why it was called Maryland was buried beneath politics, progress, and pride. The Calverts became names in history books. Henrietta Maria became a footnote. And the colony born from rebellion and faith was remembered mostly for its harvests, its harbors, its flag. Yet history is not easily silenced. Every generation leaves behind a question, and Maryland's was written into its name. Who was Mary? Why her? The answer, once whispered behind palace doors and sealed in royal ink, remained hidden in plain sight. In time, historians began to piece together the fragments. The Queen's letters, the Calvert's charters, the quiet partnership that defied an empire. They saw what few before them had noticed, that Maryland was not just land, but legacy. It was faith disguised as geography. It was rebellion wrapped in grace. And it was a love letter, a queen's gift to a world that would one day understand her courage. Today, when the sun rises over the Chesapeake and glints against the domes of Annapolis, the name Maryland still carries that echo. It's a name born from exile, written by a family who refused to let persecution define them, and blessed by a woman whose power was never in armies or decrees, but in conviction. Henrietta Maria's England exiled her faith. Cecil Calvert's enemies destroyed his peace. But neither could erase what they built together, a haven for belief, long before the world had a word for freedom. In a way, Maryland became their victory. Not in the battles they lost, but in the idea that outlived them. That faith, when guided by compassion, can build something enduring. That even the forgotten can shape the future. So when we speak the name, Maryland, we speak of both, the queen who dared to dream beyond her crown, and the exiled son who carried that dream across the sea. The world may have forgotten her story, but the land has not. Every shoreline, every church bell, every whisper of wind through the pines still carries her quiet defiance. The legacy of the queen behind the colony.